Alright, last video on Pathfinder things. So I love running the Pathfinder system. I have kind of a house rules modified version of Pathfinder. House rules for a GM, since your GM or game master, or some people call it DM or dungeon master, runs the game. They're basically God in the game, which means as a player you control your player, but pretty much nothing else in the world. So if your GM was a complete jerk and decided a boulder fell on you and killed your character, then I'm afraid your character's probably dead. But most of the time, most GMs won't even do that. They'll have you do something at least like roll a reflex save and try to get out of the way of the boulder or something. So, based on rolling things, I'm going to do a really quick video on that, just so you understand the mechanics of the game. Now, first thing to understand is the D20. I don't really need to pick that up. The D20 is the most common used die in the entire game. And D meaning die, and then 20 being how many sides it has. It has 20 sides, starting at 1 and going all the way to 20. So, no matter when you roll it, it'll hit something random, like there's a 6. So, that determines all the actions in the game. You try to throw a pot at somebody, you hit them, then you roll well, or not. So, back to my example. If your GM is a big douche and decides to try to crush you with a boulder, there's always something called a DC, or difficulty check. Don't worry about that. It's nothing special. It's just a number the DM or GM sets up that you have to beat in order to solve a situation. Let's say I was going to be mean to the player playing Balmond here, and I tell him that he hears a loud cracking up a hill that he's walking by on a mountain path. When he looks up, he sees there is a gigantic stone boulder rolling down the hill directly for him. Now, the boulder will probably kill him instantly if it hits him, so I give him a chance to make a reflex save. If you look here, like the previous video showed, punching all these numbers in to get your reflex save, he gets a 2. Because fighters aren't really very acrobatic. They're more fighting and less finesse. But fighters are also essential to most groups because they carry the weapons. So, let's say as a GM, I set up my number and I don't tell my player what it is. And I tell him, roll your reflex save. So Balmond rolls 10. So he gets a 12 because it's the 10 and then his 2 for the reflex save. Secretly, my number was 10, so he had to beat 10 in order to live. So he jumps out of the way of the boulder, it crashes down the mountain, knocks down a few trees, and sends birds flying all the way down the hill because they're all freaking out. So he's alive, yay for him. But let's say he rolled an 8. He still gets that +2, and he meets that 10. And even if I didn't tell him, he tells me he rolled a 10, I decide, okay, that means he lived. He rolls a 5 whenever he tosses and rolls. That makes it a 7 with his reflex save. That's not a 10. So the boulder hits him, crushes him, kills him, and Balmond's dead. Now, 20, I would say as a GM usually is just so spectacularly awesome, because that'd be a 22. It's an automatic success. If I made the DC impossibly high, if I made it a 30, then he gets a +2. So even rolling 20, he only gets a 22. That's still the maximum number on the die. So I would say he succeeded. That's more like he heard it, looked up, took a step back, and it rolled on past him down the hill. So that's one example. Another example, let's say Balmond is trying to talk the barmaid in a town into going on a date with him. His charisma is an 11, and he has a 0 in that. On his skill list, he doesn't really have anything in bluff. Nothing at all. Oops, I put all these in. No, those are right. Never mind. Okay, so bluff, if you go straight over, is the 3rd skill down. It relies on charisma. And he has nothing in charisma. And it's not a class skill, so he doesn't get any special pluses in that either. So, let's say he tries to talk her up. I'm sorry for the bump. And being a GM, I would say, you know, let's say Steve is playing Ballman, and he says, I want to try to talk the barmaid into going on a date with me. Okay. I would tell him, all right, well, tell me, what would Ballman say to her? And he would give me an example, but I'd also make him roll for it. So even if he said something really kind of dumb, he rolled a 16. Since his charisma doesn't give him any pluses, it's just a 16. So I would say that's pretty high. So he probably tells her she has nice eyes and stuff, and she decides to go on a walk with him, and they have a lovely little time. Now, on another skill, his strength is a +4. Somebody in the bar also likes the barmaid, gets a little upset, and decides he wants to arm wrestle with him, see who's stronger. So, what I would do as a GM is I would have Ballman roll his, so 14, and then plus his 4 for strength, so that's an 18, so that's pretty high. So that's for him grabbing and arm wrestling. Now the NPC at the same table, I, as the GM, would roll for him. Let's say he gets +2. He has a 14 strength. So, pretty beefy, but not overly so. 17. Okay, so he must really like that barmaid. So he gets a +2, so he gets a 19. 1 over Ballman's. It's a hard, arm wrestle fight, but he wins and beats Ballman. The girl liked what Ballman said so much, though, she decides to go out with him anyway, even though he lost the arm wrestling thing. The NPC, a guy named Vlad, let's say, decides to fight Ballman and draws his sword in the middle of the bar. Ballman has his Viking sword on him, so he draws his, and they decide to fight. That's where rolling things really becomes important. So all you need to know as a player is I tell you, okay, so you are playing Ballman. I tell you, the NPC, Vlad, stands up, says that it's a disgrace, that he won, he deserves the girl, and he draws his sword and glares at you. You know he's going to fight. So I would tell you Inish, which means roll initiative. See who goes first in this fight, even if you haven't drawn your sword yet. So Ballman gets a +6. You don't have to worry about what the NPC gets, because that's what the GM's job. So I roll that for Ballman, 17 +6, so wow, 23. And just on the side, you don't usually see what the GM does, but I'll roll for the NPC 12, and I'll give him a dex bonus of +1, so 13. So Ballman goes first. Now he has that feat that I mentioned earlier of quick draw. So he can draw his weapon without taking up the whole turn. So he draws it, and it tries to attack the NPC. Now AC is something the GM may or may not tell you, but that's how hard it is to hit somebody. So let's say the GM says, okay, the NPC's AC is 10. You only have to hit a 10 to get him. So Ballman attacks by swinging his sword. 14, he already hit, because it's a 14 plus the +5 that he gets to hit, so 19. He does 8 damage with his sword. So we get a 8-sided die again. And we roll that, so 3, and then plus your strength bonus for damage, so that's actually more like a 7. So he takes a pretty good gash out of this guy. Now your DM may or may not tell you how good a shape this guy's in, and usually he won't tell you the hit points of the NPC, because the fight's just going to go until he drops. But the GM will keep track of that, so don't worry. So the NPC, hurt, drops his sword, and then gets enraged and pulls a dagger. He decides to swing for Ballman. Now this is where as a player you have to care about AC, because that's how hard you are to hit. Your GM may or may not have a copy of your character sheet, so they may or may not know what your AC is, and they may have to ask you. So he swings at Ballman, and he gets 3, so he sucks. He misses. Now, some GMs have it where whenever you roll for initiative, it stays that way until the combat is over. until one of the parties is dead, or etc. I have them tend to roll each turn, because combat never really is nice and neat. So I'll roll for these two. Okay, so Balmond gets his +6 on top of a 7, so a 13. The NPC gets a 19, so he's definitely going first. He's a little enraged. So the NPC, having his dagger, strikes for Balmond. I'll roll off screen, kind of like that normally happens. And he hits Balmond. So a dagger does a d4. And I will show you what a d4 looks like. They're really interesting. Little four-sided die, little pyramid. How you read it is whenever it lands on the table, whatever lands up is there. Like this would be a 2. Some of them are actually backwards, where they have the number at the bottom, in the middle here. And on those, it's whatever it lands on the bottom of. You get it. But this one is definitely top. So he swings for Balmond, hits him, and does 2, and then his +1 for the, or +2 for the 14, I guess. Let's say he does 4 damage. So, with your HP, if I told you you took 4 damage, you go up here and he has 8. So in wounds, I would do -4. And you keep track of those, because that means he's at half health. Now, another cool thing about Pathfinder is fortitude checks. Now, when you get reduced by half of your health, you usually have to make a fortitude check to either stay conscious or not die. So usually I wouldn't do it to first level characters, but let's make Balmond do that. So 6, that's a +2, so 8. It's under 10, so it's kind of low. So Balmond fails his fortitude check after taking a dagger in the side. He got a little prideful, and he passes out. He's not dead. I'm just making him pass out. By that time, the town guard shows up. He doesn't know that. So if Balmond's the only player, you know, if there are other players around, they may jump in the fight and everything. But in this particular instance, I might have this player, I would tell them, you know, Balmond wakes up later on, and as you look around, you realize that there are town guards standing around with their arms crossed. The innkeeper is standing around looking very peeved. The barmaid looks somewhat worried because you were going to go on this nice little walk together. And the guy who fought you is nowhere to be seen. You learn later that he was thrown in prison for almost murdering somebody in a bar fight over a girl, and you are fined 10 gold to pay damages for the town guard having to come and break up a fight that very potentially you started. Now, that's how GMs run stories. What I would do from there is maybe say, well, he has no gold at all. I don't know why he was in a bar in the first place, because if you look at his money, there's nothing there. So that may be something that gets you into a campaign, is now that you owe the town guard 10 gold, they may send you to go clear out a thieves' den or something like that and start an adventure. So that pretty much concludes it, but lastly is a skills check. I'll just use a quick example. Climb. Let's say Balmond goes and tries to revisit that barmaid that he met earlier, and she decides to invite him up into her room, and he's a young man, he's 17, so he's probably going to try to climb up in there. Now the innkeep, if he finds him, will probably skewer him alive, because the barmaid is the innkeep's daughter. So, with a climb check of 8, let's say that Balmond tries to climb up a little side of the inn into the room. Wow, okay, well, he is definitely wanting to get with this girl. So he climbs up masterfully, doesn't slip at all, straight up the wall, gets to the room. But did he do it quietly? So as a GM, I may make him roll a stealth check. And stealth, not being a class skill, doesn't get the +3. He didn't take any ranks in it at all. So it goes off of dexterity, which if you remember from the ability scores up here, is a +2. So all he gets is that +2 because he doesn't have anything in here to add to it. So let's see how quiet he was. So 11. Not bad. Now, this example, he climbs up to this girl's room, starts to climb in. Now, as a GM, the player doesn't see this. I will roll to see if the barkeep hears him. He got an 11, and the barkeep will roll a perception. Perception is what you see, hear, smell, etc. Oh boy. So, a 12 plus whatever his perception is, I can determine that as a GM. So, he hears Belmond climbing up excitedly to go visit his daughter at night. And still lacking the 4 HP because he hasn't rested long enough, drank a potion, or sought a healer. If the barkeep comes out with a dagger of his own, this may be a very bad night for Belmond. So, I hope that was a helpful example. If nothing else, I would be happy to record some really brief play sessions between friends and I hope you learned something about Pathfinder from this. Have a good night.